Good morning, everyone. How you guys doing? Rested? Ready to learn? Okay, good.
Not really.
No, okay. All right, we'll work with that. Okay, so last week, this previous week, you guys learned about the neuron. You learned a lot about biology. I'm sure those of you who love biology are ecstatic. The rest of you will please do come speak to me if anything from the last week was kind of cumbersome to understand. We'll review it a little bit, and I'll try to give some context for why this information is important. My goal here in you taking this class is to give you some information that's actually going to help you in your life. And so I'm going to be trying to make that connection today. Before we kind of get into stuff, any questions or concerns generally related to the class? Everyone got a chance to turn in their second hypothesis. Any troubles with that?
I turned in my second one like fine, but I emailed you because I messed up on my first one and it's still like not there.
I'm sorry, well, what about the last half of that I missed? So what about the first one?
The first one I like put it inside like the board to submit it and I like forgot to hit submit. And I emailed you about it. Do you know when that might be able to be put in?
Oh, are you still not able to do that? Yes, I should actually be able to do that very quickly. You could do that right. No, I think I received yours. I actually gave feedback on it.
Oh, okay.
I think it was submitted. Yeah, I didn't find anything wrong with it. It was actually very well done. Any other concerns, questions?
So do they
Yes.
the hypothesis? Oh, the hypothesis. Do they have to be certain things, or can they all be different? Because I didn't know that.
They can all be different. They do not build on one another. So the goal here is you're going to be submitting 3 different hypotheses, and they could be related if you want them to be, but they can't be exactly the same. But you'll be submitting 3 hypotheses, and then for the research proposal, you'll pick one of those to write a longer paper about.
All right, that's what I thought. Thank you.
With my hypothesis, me and you are emailing back and forth, but I already submitted it, the original one, before we started emailing it. Can I email the updated one to you after this, or?
Yes. Send me an email to remind me, and then we'll work with that. Sure.
Okay.
All right. Good otherwise? Any other questions? All right. What I want to start with is what we started with last time. You're going to have to make experiments, and I want to make sure everyone understands how to make experiments. Who wants to define for me what is an experiment again? What's the defining feature of an experiment? I really want you to leave this class knowing what an experiment is. That would be more of just a generic study. So if we're doing research, yeah, we're trying to understand something about it's a formal evaluation of something. but there's something that makes an experiment stand out from all other research methods.
It addresses third variable problems.
Yes, meaning what?
It lets you see the cause of the relationship between two other variables.
Yes, it allows you to evaluate the cause of the relationship between two variables. So we want to know how if one thing causes a change in the other. An experiment is the only thing that allows you to do that. And it allows that because of what? What's the design of an experiment? So let's say that I want to know whether eating a Snickers bar is going to make you less hungry. How would I determine that in an experiment?
You can get 3 groups. Like A group will eat the Snickers. B group would eat Snickers and something else, maybe like another kind of snack or actual food. And C group wouldn't eat anything.
Yes. So we're going to be splitting people up into groups. And I agree with group A. We're going to give them Snickers. Group B, why give them something? Why give them Snickers and something else?
Just to see if it actually would do something different. Well, I mean, they would actually be full. So you can test that because you have food in your system plus quote unquote dessert, I guess. I don't know.
Okay. So I'm not sure if that's exactly what we want to test. I think instead maybe do something like give people a Milky Way bar, right? So they're still eating something that's like a Snickers, but it's not a Snickers. Because our question is, does specifically a Snickers make you less hungry, right?
Yeah, so just like change the type of bar. That's what you're
Change
saying?
the type of bar. Yes, change the
Okay.
type of bar. Yep, you got that. And then the third group, it's not that they should be allowed to do whatever they want. What are they going to do?
Not eat anything at all. Like no sneakers, no other brands.
You got it. Yeah, that's the control group. So they're not going to do anything. They're not going to eat anything. All right. So we as the experimenters actually manipulate our independent variable. So if we think one thing causes another thing, we're manipulating, we're changing that first thing, that first variable. That's what makes an experiment. We control that. So we give you a Snickers or a Milky Way or absolutely nothing. So we know that the only difference, if we observe a difference between those groups, we know that the only difference is what they received. Snickers, Milky Way, or nothing. So we can conclude about causation then. Okay, so I want to give us an opportunity to practice a little bit more. Does anyone want to throw out one of their hypotheses and practice designing an experiment? Again, if you do this, you can certainly use that experiment for your research proposal.
Could you please repeat what you just said? It like blanked out on my side.
Oh, no problem. I understand. Yeah, please do tell me if I ever get cut off. Thank you. Does anyone want to throw out one of their hypotheses that we can design an experiment to test it?
Mine is kind of weird. I don't really like. I could study it, but I don't know if it would like let's say help. Mine was about. Hold on. I said, could we study if weather affects someone's intimacy in bed?
Sorry, what affects intimacy?
Like actual like physical weather, like weather forecasts.
Affects people's intimacy. Interesting. Okay.
So, yeah.
What would you predict about that? So what are your thoughts? How do you think weather affects that?
Well, my prediction was like a rainy/cold day, a couple could have more intercourse than a day that is like blazing hot. Most people don't like being touched and like touched in general. Like if it's hot outside, don't bother me.
Right, exactly. Unless there's air conditioning going on.
Like,
Right?
so,
That's an interesting
Yeah.
one because so what we'd have to do, what would we have to do to make that an experiment? What would we be manipulating, presumably? What is the independent variable, and what would we be changing?
Well, we couldn't really manipulate weather, so the independent would be the actual weather. So like if it's hot, cold, or something, intimacy is the dependent. So based upon the weather, you get how much action you get in bed.
You got it. Yes. Yeah. So our independent variable would be weather, which you're right. We don't have control over the weather. So how might we test that hypothesis given that we can't control the weather? What other things could we control or manipulate?
If we did it to like a smaller scale, so instead of completely outside, we can like control the temperature inside.
Okay, that would
to get like a
work.
closer study.
So we can manipulate the temperature. How else could we? So when I think of weather, I also think when it's rainy out, it might get humid, right? And so we could also say use a humidifier to humidify the room or humidify their house, right? Yeah, that is a good one. So we can't control weather. So we have to replace it with something. If we think that weather is going to change intimacy because when it's warmer people don't want to have sex, or when it's humid people just don't want to like touch because everyone's all sticky, right? Then maybe that's what we have to manipulate. We actually have to manipulate the consequences of weather changing, stickiness or temperature. So that's good. Okay, good. So how would we, let's say we're going to manipulate temperature. How would we design that experiment? What steps would we go through? How are we dividing people up into groups, etc.?
You you would have to have like a normal temperature, like so the constant, but that's kind of, oh dang, that's hard to think about because like you kind of can't have a constant determined temperature at a different rate. So like my room here we keep it at like 60 something, but someone else's room could be 72, and that'd be perfectly fine.
That would be our control.
That's the range of
Yeah, so that would be our
you
control.
can talk.
Oh, sorry, no, I keep interrupting you. I think there's a slight delay, so I'm habitually talking over you. So that's going to be our control group, and yeah, you're right that different people are going to have different kind of baseline what's room temperature. So how could we solve that? What would we do? And other
Could we
people
do like? What did you say?
Sorry, I was just telling everyone can help with this as well. This doesn't have to be all on you.
Oh yeah, y'all can help definitely. My brain is hurting right now. I would say you could do a questionnaire kind of. So like kind of group and section people into areas that they are for doing the actual study.
True. So maybe we could determine everyone's preference beforehand, but then things wouldn't be consistent because we can't have a control group where the temperature is just whatever they prefer. I guess we could. Maybe control group is always preferred temperature. Okay, that's a reasonable solution. I think that I don't think I'm saying there's not too much wrong with that. The other thing you can do is maybe you have multiple control groups where you have some people who are consistently at, maybe you take that preference data and then you create a couple of groups where you see that, well, most people are at comfort between 68 and 74. And so you create a 74-degree control group and a 72-degree control group and a 70-degree, and you have multiple control groups. That'd be one alternative. Okay, so that would be the control group. Then what would be our experimental? So we have the baseline group. And then how are we going to manipulate, and I guess in this case, weather, or however we're going to be measuring weather?
By having 2 different ranges. So one range could be within like the 50s of a room, and then the other one could be within like 90s.
Okay, great. So we'll go for the extremes, really hot and really cold. So we have an experimental group dedicated to really cold weather and an experimental group dedicated to really hot weather. I like that. Or if we were doing the humidifying thing, we could, crank the humidifier up really high in one room for one group, and then keep it relatively, just turn it off for the other groups. That would work. Okay, so that takes care of our independent variable. Now, how are we going to measure your outcome, which is intimacy?
How many times do it?
Okay, yeah, sure. How many times they have sex? Sorry, what's the time frame? Yeah.
Or yeah, I guess the amount of.
Yeah, so maybe the number, so what's the time frame though? So if you're going to say the number of times that people have sex within a day, within a week.
My range was within a week, so we would count how many times per day within each week, or within.
Good, yes. So just important that you specify that. That can really be whatever you want, but a week sounds good. So maybe we're going to have people in these rooms or at these temperatures for a week, and then see how often they have sex during that week, or how often they touch one another, or how many times they kiss one another, or however you want to measure intimacy, how often they give each other compliments, right? How often they stare deeply, and how long they stare deeply into each other's eyes. All of those would be perfectly fine dependent variables or outcomes. Yeah. Okay, good. That's a full-fledged experiment. You got an independent variable, you've operationalized it. You have a dependent variable, you've operationalized it, and you've described how you're going to divvy participants up into different groups and how long you're going to record your data. That's all that anyone should ever have to do for an experiment. Just as simple as that. You could fit all of that into a paragraph, and it should be about a paragraph in length. All right, anyone else want to practice with another question? I'm happy to dedicate class time to this because, again, an important skill to build, I believe. There's something that I want to highlight. One of the things that I saw in a number of hypotheses was that a lot of people would, so let's take this question for an example. Does smoking marijuana have a negative impact on someone's behavior? If you have an outcome like negative impact or behavior, you always have to specify what that means. So I think that for a lot of us, it might be intuitive of, okay, if your question is, how does alcohol cause negative behavior? You might, in your mind, have a very clear idea of what that negative behavior means. Maybe people act more violently. Maybe they are, they have less impulse control, so they're more likely to act on their impulses. Or they are more likely to slur their words while they're at work, or they're more likely to, whatever it happens to be. You have a clear idea of what that means, but the reader does not. So when you say negative impact on someone's behavior, as you're operationally defining that, you can't just say you're going to measure behavior. Just be very, very specific about what you mean. So let's take this example of marijuana. We can if we're turning this into an experiment, what we can do is pretty easily operationally define the independent variable. So if you think that smoking marijuana has some kind of negative impact, we could measure the number of days per week that you smoke, right? So do you smoke 7 days a week? So these would be our different groups. Our experimental groups would be whether you smoke 7 days a week, 4 days a week, or 1 day a week. And then the control would be 0 days a week, because they're not doing any of it. So that's how you would operationally define the independent variable. How would you operationally define dependent variable? If we're asking this question, what kind of negative impacts do you think at least people believe marijuana might cause? You smoke it, and what could be the problem?
What was the question again? I'm sorry.
How would you measure, no, you're good. How would you measure the negative impact that smoking marijuana could have on a person?
Maybe like how many times they get in a verbal fight with someone they know.
Okay, so the number of times they get into, did you say a verbal fight?
Yes, sir.
Like have an argument with someone. Okay, so maybe to some degree, people who smoke more are more likely to get into kind of, arguments in and of themselves maybe are not bad, but like kind of aggressive verbal fighting. Okay, so maybe we count up the number of times someone gets into a verbal argument. Okay.
We could measure like what they are, because some people don't act normally. Some people normally act angry whenever, let's say, they're sober, but it could just amplify or it could just soothe them. So we would have to base it upon who we are testing on.
But how would we? I agree. It'll depend on who we're testing. But then how would we measure that? So what are some of the stereotypes of, okay, if you smoke marijuana, what's at least the stereotype? What kind of negative impact does it have on a person's mind? How does it make them behave?
I know that.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
You have the floor. Go ahead, Haley.
Okay. I know when I was younger, I was taught that when you smoke weed, sometimes you go on a really high because you're high. And then when you come down, you're at a really bad mental state. And so people smoke more to stay at that high. And when they come down, it's like, whoa.
Okay, so that would be something like dependence, right? So whether you are likely to, it's complicated because the negative impact that you're, I guess, outlining here is people are going to smoke not because it necessarily feels good, but because it prevents them from feeling bad. And we'll actually talk about that when we get to consciousness. We'll talk about drugs. We'll talk about that and what that looks like and why that happens. That is true. I want to focus though, because that one's hard to operationalize. But let's focus on like, again, what stereotypes exist? Like, so what might we do to you if you smoke it, or how might it affect your behavior? So you do get high, but okay, what does that look like? How would you operationalize being high?
Some people get giggly. Like they just chill out and laugh at a lot of things, and they eat a lot. The munchies.
Okay, so there's a potential negative impact, right? If you're high, you get the munchies, then you could be eating more than is healthy, right? So maybe one of the negative impacts we can measure is how much food beyond what you normally eat do you eat when you smoke? Right. So what could we count that? We could count up what the number of bags of chips you eat.
Yeah, like how many snacks you eat on top of what you ate before you was high. Like just say you eat dinner and then you go outside and you smoke a blunt and then now you eating like chips and Oreos and all this other kind of stuff.
Yeah, so you could you could literally measure the number of Oreos you eat or the weight of potato chips that you consume, right? As a way of measuring overeating. That's good. I like that. What kind of negative impacts are at least stereotyped to be more likely than someone who smoked? Does anyone have a belief about how it affects your intelligence or the way that your mind works? Like does anyone have any heard anything like that?
Kills brain cells.
Okay, sure. So we can have the hypothesis that it kills brain cells, and presumably that's going to be associated with intelligence. How would we measure intelligence? What aspect of intelligence do you think would be affected by marijuana? If you could operationalize that area of intelligence.
Could you have them take like an IQ test after like they smoke for a week and then like have someone who doesn't smoke take it?
Absolutely. An IQ test. Those of you who don't realize what that is, it's an intelligence test. It's standardized. It's it kind of plots your ability to solve problems. So IQ tests will usually involve solving puzzles, and it'll test verbal memory, your how large your vocabulary is, how quickly you process information. So not just whether you can solve a puzzle, but how quickly you solve that puzzle. So yeah, there might be differences in those. Yeah.
So going off of him, can you also do a group that's high while doing it and a group that's not high while doing it and determine it then?
Yes, you could do that too. So that's good. We can operationalize the independent variable different ways. So maybe it's not how frequently you smoke, but simply whether you are currently high or not. Yes. So you'd have a group where you're currently high and a control group where you've not smoked at all. Okay, that's good. I just really wanted to make the point that if you talk about negative impacts, you talk about behavior, you need to be very specific about how you define it. Remember that when you operationalize your outcome, your dependent variable, it's almost always something that you can count up, you can add together, you can divide it. There needs to be a number there. Okay, questions about experiments? Okay. All right. Let's segue. Again, I will be claiming that learning about neurons for some reason, how your biology works, is going to improve your life in some way. How might it? How might learning about the biology of your psychology improve your day-to-day life? How could that be useful to you?
It might help you understand why someone else thinks something or feels a way.
Okay, true. And yes, and how so? Like how would understanding that the nervous system is made up of neurons and you trade neurotransmitters and et cetera, how is that going to help you understand someone else? You're right. I want to go a little deeper. We haven't gone over this yet, but in this upcoming week, we're going to go over the bigger picture of the nervous system. So not the microscopic neurons, but how those neurons fit together and the systems that they create. And so you have a brain, and that brain is divided up into different parts, and each part is responsible for something else. So let's imagine that we want to understand why someone is doing what they're doing or why they feel the way that they do. We might be able to look into their brain and say, well, as they made this decision, as they decided, okay, today I'm gonna, when they were in the bar and they got into a fight, can we actually look at what part of the brain was responsible for them to make the decision, today I'm getting into a fight? Maybe there was something in an area that controls emotion or regulation of your emotion. Maybe we'll understand how alcohol, which usually factors into bar fights, affects the brain and maybe alters how likely you are to get into a fight. So yeah, we can understand why other people do the things that they do. Any other reasons you should want to understand how your neurons work, how your nervous system works? Let's think about why it's useful to understand how anything works mechanically. Why is it helpful to know how a car works, how an engine works?
So if it breaks, you can fix it?
Yup. A car is a mechanical object. You can fix a mechanical object. Your brain, everything about you and who you are and how your psychology works, it's due to a mechanical object, your nervous system. There's nothing kind of magical or metaphysical about your consciousness and what's happening in front of you. It is the product of a physical system. So if we understand how that physical system works, then we can fix it. How might you, given what you know about the neuron now, what I've just taught you, is there anything that we could influence about your neuron that would maybe fix it or change it? Or anything that we have talked about? How do we fix? How do we treat psychological disorders? How do we, if you experience a lot of anxiety or you're suffering from a major depression, major depressive disorder, what do you do? Fix that system.
Give like medication to help. I don't remember. It was like the medicines we were talking about. I'm trying to find it in my notes, but
The antidepressants?
Oops, sorry, I got this. Yeah, absolutely, antidepressants. And so medications, yes. So what medications do is, I'm gonna ask you to dig back into the information. Think about the axon terminal, the very end of the neuron, where those little packets of neurotransmitters, and they get released into the synapse. When you take some kind of drug, a psychoactive drug that is meant to, say, alleviate anxiety or help you with depression, what you're doing is you're taking a drug that actually changes usually how many neurotransmitters are released within that synaptic cleft. So what we can do is given what we know about how the neuron works, we can actually go in, give people drugs to change how those neurons work. You're changing a physical system there. Okay. So there is use to this. And, some of you will, the likelihood of anyone developing some kind of psychological disorder normally is about 1 in 4, so 25% of people. So if this class is about, well, people come and go, but about 16 people, let's say, 4 people out of 16 will at some point be diagnosed with a psychological disorder. And given everything that's going on, turns out with COVID and all that, the rate of psychological disorders is going up. understandably, people are lonely, people are losing their jobs, there's a lot of hardship, and that's going to affect that system, your nervous system. So this information, even if it's not entirely useful to you now, will potentially be helpful to you. And it'll at least help you understand maybe what's going on with someone else, if not with yourself. But here's an argument that I want to give you. And this is something that I'm going to run with. This is a concept, an idea that we are going to use for the rest of this class. And I'm going to lean on it very heavily during the learning chapter and the memory chapter, which will be our next chapters. Your body is constantly building and modifying connections within your nervous system. There are a lot of organs within your body that once they developed, they're just kind of there doing their job. They might repair themselves, but they're not really fundamentally changing anything about how they work. The nervous system does. The nervous system is constantly trying to make connections, and if they're important, make those connections really strong, and if they're not important, they get rid of those connections. As you're learning right now, you're listening to me, and hopefully, getting something out of it. What's happening is you are building new connections. When you learn something in this class, when you learn how to make an experiment, you are literally creating a connection within your brain that's dedicated to your knowledge of experiments. So we're constantly modifying this thing. And when we modify it, that modification has a name. It's called long-term potentiation. Long-term potentiation is when stimulating a neuron strengthens the connection between that neuron and the next cell. So the more you stimulate a neuron, the stronger a connection becomes with the next cell. So remember, at the end of the axon terminal, where you have that synapse, where you dump those neurotransmitters, the goal of putting neurotransmitters into that synaptic cleft is for them to bind to the receptors of the next cell. So of trying to get your neuron to communicate a message to another neuron, or communicate it to a muscle cell, or communicate it to your liver, to get your muscle to flex, or your liver to store sugars. So the more we stimulate it, the more likely that connection is to become stronger. Here's a chart I want to use to try and explain that. So on the left side, we have that axon terminal, and how this is a depiction of it hooking up with the next cell. This is familiar. This is similar to what I showed you. So we have again the axon terminal full of, what are those packets called? So what is a packet of neurotransmitters called? Those little circles that are filled with dots, those neurotransmitters. What are those packets called? Uh-oh, forgot what this is for the exam. What are those packets called?
Neurotransmitters?
So the little things inside of them are the neurotransmitters.
I thought that was what you talked about.
The bigger package that contains them.
Okay.
That's called the synaptic. That's a synaptic vesicle. Synaptic vesicle. It's a container. It's a vessel. It kind of bunches them all together. And then yes, inside are the neurotransmitters. So when that action potential, that electrical impulse, when it's being transmitted to the axon terminal, it causes those neurotransmitters to be released into the synapse, which you see there. They bind with the receptors on the opposite side. And binding to those receptors then causes that next cell to do something. That's the connection, all right? Well, let's imagine that this connection here is responsible for you learning how to do a layup. So you're on the basketball team. When you first started learning how to do a layup, it was probably very difficult for you. You had to think very long and hard about how your body needs to be positioned. Your feet might need to be in a certain position. Your body needs to be at a certain angle from the basket. And when you jump up, the ball needs to be within your hand, and you need to extend outward and keep your body in a kind of a certain turn to propel it forward. So there are all these little details that you didn't know and you had to learn. You had to create a connection within your brain that was dedicated to knowing how to do a layup. When you first started doing it, the connection looked like it was like on the left side here. It existed maybe, but it wasn't very well developed. Now let's say you repeatedly stimulated that connection such that you did a layup again, and you did it again, and you did it again. Maybe you adjust something and you try it again, and you perfect that technique. You keep doing it over and over and over again. What happens when you start doing something over and over and over again?
You eventually learn it.
You learn it, and it's a lot easier to do then. It becomes almost automatic. It's very natural to do it. What's happening when something feels more natural, when you can do it almost unconsciously, you go to a game and your mind isn't on how to do a layup. Your mind is, what's my opponent doing? Are they going to move left? Are they going to move right? Oh, did we get disconnected? Oh, I think people are reconnecting. I'll give it a second. We all reconnected now? We had an interruption. You're not thinking about whether you can how to dribble the ball. You're not thinking about how to do a layup. You already have, that's already automatic. The reason for that is as you stimulate this connection again and again and again, that connection will become stronger, and therefore it will become second nature. It will become automatic. And this is how this happens. If you follow this image from the left to the right, what changes between the left and the right image? What's the difference?
You get more like I think they're the vesicles, like the little circles on the top.
Anything else? So that's one. There are more synaptic vesicles.
More channels.
More channels on the next cell. So you have more neurotransmitters because you have more synaptic vesicles, and therefore you have more receptors. How's this going to make the response stronger? How does this make the connection stronger or more reliable? Anyone want to take a guess at that?
Since it's more little neurotransmitters and openings, it's more ways to come in and out.
Yes. And so one detail, the neurotransmitters aren't kind of going in and out of those channels, but they're binding to those channels. And those channels let in other things like sodium and potassium and all that. But yes, if there are more neurotransmitters, there will be more neurotransmitters in the synapse, and then therefore they can bind to more of these channels. And so more channels will open up. And if more channels are opening up, then that allows the next cell to respond more strongly. So if you were to measure the electrical charge that the connection on the left and the connection on the right creates, that's what's graphed on the bottom here. So you can kind of see that it starts off low, it goes up high, and then it comes back down. That's measuring the electrical charge. So when you have more synaptic vesicles and more receptors, you create a stronger electrical charge. And if the electrical charge is stronger, that makes a more reliable connection. So that when you try to do a layup, it just happens. You don't have to think about it. It's automatic.
So it's like the peak of that line, is that like when you're in the action of doing the layup?
Yes, yes. So what this is actually measuring is it's the average activity across all of your across all the neurons that are responsible for doing a layup. So if you were to kind of remember there's the action potential where there's a spike in electrical activity. It goes up and then it comes back down and then it kind of evens back out. What we're doing is we're adding up a lot of that peak electrical charge up here. So we're thinking of all the connections responsible for a layup. We're adding together the most activity, the highest activity. And that's what we get. We get that with those charts. Okay. Another way to think about long-term potentiation is it's the idea of use it or lose it. You've probably heard this. Someone has told you, you know what, if you don't continually think about something, if you don't study a lot, or if you have studied and then you never think about it again, you might forget something. There's some truth to that. So if you're studying for one of the exams in this class, what you'll do is you might take notes, you might watch the video, so you've stimulated those neurons, you've created the connection in the first place. Then you write down notes. The action of taking notes causes you to repeat the information to yourself. That's why it's good to take notes. Yes, you could just watch the video again, but if you write notes, what you're doing is you're building kind of a motor connection. You're building that connection that's responsible for you kind of writing out that is going to strengthen your memory of whatever you're learning. So always write those notes. You're strengthening the connection with notes. Then when you go back and you study your notes and you quiz yourself, you're repeating that information. And so you're building that connection. You're making it stronger. You're making it more reliable. You're using it. Then you take the test. Then you never think about it again, because I don't have to be quizzed on what structuralism is anymore. I'm not going to be quizzed on what functionalism. Who's Sigmund Freud? He's not been relevant. So the less you think about Freud, the more likely you are to lose that connection and go, wait a second, who is Freud again? What was that connection? That's use it or lose it. That's long-term potentiation. So increased activity produces stronger and faster responses. And then decreased activity within the neuron, not stimulating it, produces weaker and slower responses. Okay, following this logic, why do I ask you guys to do hypotheses and experiments?
So we'll remember like independent, dependent, and controlled, and how to make like an experiment.
Yes. Again and again, no matter where you go outside of a psychology class, you're going to have to understand independent and dependent variables in any science. And you'll need to know what an experiment is. The more that we go over this, the more often we review it, the stronger that connection is going to become. Eventually, I want you to get to the point where if you hear the words independent variable, the connection is so solid, it's so quick and so strong that you immediately think, oh, that's the thing that I'm manipulating. That's the thing that I change, independent variable. And if you hear dependent variable, oh, that's the outcome. That's the thing that I'm measuring. You want it to be quick, you want it to be solid, so that when you get on the test, when you have to, I don't know, maybe you get hired as a research assistant, you're gonna want that information, you're gonna wanna, it's gonna be you're gonna want it to be second nature. The quicker you can just have that association, the better you're gonna be at your job. So yes, also operationally defining variables. That's something that people don't do very often. So I stress that so much. You've heard me say operationalize your variables so often because I want that connection strong. All right, good. Anyone want to relate this to anything else in your life? So do you see long-term potential? Where else do we see long-term potentiation? Can we think of other examples of that? Does this feel true?
Like getting dressed every morning.
Yeah.
You wake up and get.
So how so? How is that the consequence of long-term potentiation? Sure.
Like you wake up and you get dressed in the same steps. Like maybe you take a shower, then you put on your clothes, then you brush your teeth, then you brush your hair, and you get in the repetition of doing it in that order.
Yep. Yeah. Doing all that stuff in the morning can feel like a real hassle if you don't typically do it, right? if you don't normally take a shower or work out, that's the big thing for people who work out, who need to exercise. Kind of the secret to being able to continue to exercise is to just get that habit going, right? When you first start working out, super big, it's a trudge. It's tough. But you do it enough, what you're doing is your body has those connections. So to get up, put your gym clothes on, go work out, do some rowing on the rowing machine behind me, and just get that done. If you have those connections built, it's actually a lot easier. Part of that is you're working up your muscles too, and as your muscles are stronger, it's less painful to work out. But a lot of that is neurological too, just being in that habit. Yeah, you probably wake up in the morning and you don't have to think about how you're going to put your clothes on. You might make a decision about what clothes you wear, but you know how to put your leg through pants right now. You know how to put a shirt on. When you were a kid, you might have had a lot of difficulty with that, but you've done it enough that it's second nature. You know how to brush your teeth. You know how to take a shower. You might even get into the shower and you go through all those motions, and you might even in the middle of taking a shower be like, wait a second, did I wash my hair? I can't remember. Because you're just doing it automatically. That connection's really strong. That's good. Yeah. Okay. Here's the critical thinking question that's going to lead us into to the rest of the semester. I've introduced these 3 concepts to you. First, it was cognitive biases, and this I defined as the tendency to think or behave in a way that leads to a systematic deviation from rationality or good judgment. I talked about this with authority bias and chicken noodle soup and Sprite or ginger ale. Talked about confirmation bias, the tendency to search for information that already confirms our beliefs. I then introduced heuristics, simple and efficient ways of solving a problem, rules of thumb, these kind of automatic responses that we have. And now I've taught you about long-term potentiation. I want you to take a minute and think, how are these 3 things related? Does anyone see that connection?
They all help you complete a task.
Okay, good. So these are all features of the nervous system. They help us do something. That is true. Think back to chicken noodle soup and Sprite. What you've learned is that if you drink or eat these things, it will cure the flu. How have you learned that through long-term potentiation? It's tough, I know. I'm asking a very difficult question here. Let me start out. If you are in the habit that every time you get sick, you get the flu, your temperature is high, you immediately think to yourself, I should drink some soup and I should drink Sprite. What you've done is you've created a connection within your brain that says, when I get sick, I should eat chicken noodle soup. It's automatic. You think of it immediately. This is what one should do in this situation. That is your simple and efficient way of solving the problem, right? That is your heuristic. Your heuristic is when one gets soup, you should drink. When one gets soup. When one gets sick, you should drink soup. And you've built that connection by doing it repeatedly or hearing it repeatedly. When you were a child, your parents may have said, "Okay, you're sick. Here, drink some chicken noodle soup. Oh, you're sick. Drink some." Oh, we got some disconnections. Again and again, you've heard that from your parents. And so now when you're older, through long-term potentiation, through strengthening that connection, you now have that automatic response. Get sick, drink chicken noodle soup. Okay, let's, welcome back. I don't know how people got disconnected. Okay, so can we apply that logic to something else, another cognitive bias you have?
When I was little, when I would try to fight my sleep, I always drink milk, and it's supposed to help me sleep, I guess.
So how did that get built up? Yeah, that's a great example. So run us through how you might have learned that through long-term potentiation. What would that look like? That's a good example.
When I was younger and I would always fight my sleep, my mother would be like, "Okay, I'm gonna go to the kitchen, I'm gonna get some milk, put it in a glass, and you're gonna drink it, and then you're gonna fall asleep." It's like a soothing mechanism, I guess you can call it.
Right. So you may have, I mean, to some degree, warm milk especially can be very soothing, right? If you're kind of cold or you're just kind of like, I mean, when you're sleepy, you like to get cozy and warm, right? So drinking something warm right before bed can kind of be soothing. So what you may have learned is drinking milk beforehand makes me sleepy. Therefore, if I want to fall asleep, if you're in a situation where you want to fall asleep, you immediately say to yourself, I should drink milk. That's your heuristic. That's your rule of thumb. If you want to fall asleep, drink milk. You've learned that by continually strengthening that connection that says, oh, whenever I drink milk, I tend to get sleepier.
But it's kind of like changed over the years. Like before, yeah, it was like warm milk, and now warm milk is disgusting to me, so I always drink cold milk now. So it kind of changed, but it's still within the same thing.
Yeah, interesting. And actually, I agree with you. Warm milk is disgusting. But yeah, that's interesting. So at some point, you can actually build a connection between milk and sleep, and it doesn't have to be warm. So maybe originally the warmth of it actually made you fall asleep more. But at a certain point, you might simply learn that when you taste milk, it kind of calms you, right? So it's not really about the warmth of it anymore, but simply that you are drinking some kind of milk. That does happen. We'll talk about that when we go over learning. We'll talk about, that's something called generalization. It's when you learn something and then you, without teaching the terminology in the chapter, it's difficult for me to explain what generalization is, but it's when you use something that's very similar. So in this case, milk. So when originally you needed warm milk and now you just need milk in general, that's generalization. So that you've associated warm milk with falling asleep, and you generalize that to simply being milk helps you fall asleep. We'll talk about the technicals of that one in time.
I have one more too. You
I
know
love it. Yeah, thank you.
the weighted blankets that they be selling at Walmart?
One moment, my dog's barking.
Okay.
Okay, she's calm for now. Sorry, go ahead.
You know how like Walmart and other stores have started selling like the weighted blankets? So I connect that to when I was also younger and when I like to be held and stuff like that when I'm sad or mad or whatever. And so weighted blankets, even for little babies to this day, my little cousin uses it. It calms them because it feels like they're being held by the parent or by their significant other if they're older. So I think that's a connection.
Yes, I think that's right. Yeah, we associate touch and the weight of touch. I mean, that's the important part is when someone hugs you, there's pressure, right? And so you start to associate not just their presence and what they feel like, but kind of how much pressure your body feels when you're being comforted. So yeah, if you put a weighted blanket on, what you're doing is you're simulating that pressure of kind of someone being kind of on top of you or hugging you or comforting you in that way. Yeah, I think that that is building a connection. You've associated weight, the feeling of pressure on your body with comfort. So then you use this blanket that is not a person, but it does give that weight and it comforts you. You have that connection. That's a good one. Yeah. Trying to think of other stuff like that. It's kind of like body pillows. Body pillows, likewise. I mean, there's the sensation of falling asleep, cuddling someone. It's very comforting, and so you can get a body pillow, which is potentially as big as a person, put your body around it, and then you have that same sensation of comfort and support as when you're cuddling somebody. It's not a perfect replacement, but the connection is strong enough that it activates the connection.
I don't know if this would count or not, but like my animal, my little dog, she's like my daughter. And when I'm home, she's always on me. And when I'm away from her, I always feel kind of like I'm missing my other half because she's my daughter. So I always put her as a connection with like being near something and just loving on her and she's loving on me. I don't know if that would count.
Yeah, no, I mean it's that does count. Again, you're
It's like a
associating.
comfort.
Yep, the dog is associated with other sources of comfort, and so just your other family or the other house or other people. And so when you are around that dog might remind you of these other people that are comforting to you. Yeah. I mean, this is how dogs learn. When you try to train a dog, what you have to do is help that dog create a connection within their nervous system. If you want them to sit, what they need to learn is when their butt hits the ground, they get a treat. So every time their butt hits the ground, you give them a treat. Eventually, they start to realize, oh, when I sit, I get fed. That's a connection. That's a heuristic that they now have. When I'm hungry, I should sit. It's my rule of thumb. And it's typically a good rule of thumb to have for a dog. All right. Is this connection sinking in? You see the connection between these different concepts that we've learned so far. Questions about this? All right. Well, moving forward. So next week, we're going to be going over again the larger nervous system. We're going to talk about how the brain works. We're also going to talk about the endocrine system, which is like the nervous system. It communicates information, but it does it through hormones. And then just generally what the nervous system looks like, how things are connected. From there, we'll go on to learning. And so we're gonna see how this nervous system serves us, how we create those connections, and ideally, what we'll do is we'll go over some techniques for studying. That is, if you have a hard time creating connections for schoolwork, we'll go over some techniques for helping you with that. How to kind of maximize the long-term potentiation of vocabulary words that you need to learn, or anything you learn for class.
I have a question about
Yes.
like a hypothesis question. So I'm thinking about doing if you drink energy drinks, is it like a psychological thing that you get energy, or do you actually get energy? So how would I form that?
Yeah, so I mean, focus on the behavior. So what do you think energy drinks are going to do? I actually have an answer for you. I can answer that question for you, but in terms of being able to measure that, how would you, so you're giving people different amounts of energy drink. What do you think your outcome would be?
The amount of activity they get up and do, or how active they are.
Yeah, and then how would you operationalize that?
So measure, if I give a person 5 energy drinks, I mean, they'll have a heart attack, but are they more like, and then measure the amounts of times they get up and do stuff.
Okay, yeah, so maybe the number of times that they stand up and start walking around or doing things. Yeah, that would be a good way to operationalize it. To answer your question though, energy drinks don't literally give you, well, okay, it's complicated. They do give you energy to the extent that they have sugar in them. So as much as drinking any sugary drink or anything that has glucose in it, then an energy drink will give you that energy that your body can use. But what really makes an energy drink is the stimulants that are in it. So caffeine, and then usually they have taurine in there, which I think complements and it actually exaggerates how effective caffeine is. And what that does is, caffeine doesn't give you energy. What it does is it speeds up the rate at which your body consumes energy. So it doesn't give you energy. What it does is it allows your body to, so if you have stored sugars within your body, it'll release that sugar and then use it. And so if you're using more sugar, your body has more access to that, then you'll be able to get more done. You'll move faster. But that's also why you crash after you have energy drinks, is your body uses up the stored energy and then it doesn't have any energy left over, at least compared to before. So you feel terrible afterwards. So yeah, energy drinks can actually be somewhat addictive, mildly addictive, where, I mean, any caffeine, coffee, tea, stuff like that, you can actually get addicted to caffeine, such that your body will expect a certain rate of energy consumption or a certain amount of kind of sugar and glucose in the blood, and then if you stop using it, you're expecting to be as productive, but your body doesn't have the drug that it needs, that caffeine. So yeah, it speeds up the rate at which you consume energy. It doesn't actually give you energy. There's not like some metaphysical, like there's like energy that's flowing into your body. It just speeds up how quickly your nervous system works. Yeah, good question. We'll actually talk a little bit about that when we go over drugs as well. That's what meth does. That's what cocaine does. Any stimulant speeds up the activity of your nervous system and makes you consume more stored energy than you otherwise would. Other questions? Okay. Well, I'm going to let you guys go a little bit early. I know I still have 5 minutes, but that's all I have prepared for today. So everything should be online. Make sure to get that exam done before the next class, and we will continue on next week. Let me know if you have any questions or concerns. Thank you all for being here.